At gate C12 after a red-eye, my son texted, "Don't come near us." I read it twice, as though my tired eyes had failed me the first time. But there it was, black letters glowing on the small screen, sharp as broken glass. I lifted my head and saw him across the waiting area, his tall frame bent over his phone, his wife at his side, their little boy slumped against her shoulder. He did not look up, not even once, as if willing me invisible. I wheeled my small suitcase past him, each step feeling like it dragged the weight of years, and that's when I realized the text was not a mistake. It was a line drawn. A boundary I had not been invited to cross. Airports have a way of exposing you, stripping you down to movement and waiting, to the sound of rolling wheels and overhead announcements, to the anonymous tide of strangers who brush past without care. In that moment, I envied their indifference. No one knew that a mother had just been told she was unwelcome, that her son's eyes, once the first I'd searched for in delivery rooms and classrooms and graduation crowds, were now carefully averted, guarding a space I was no longer allowed to enter. I sat near the window, where the glass looked out on the blinking lights of the tarmac. Planes arrived and departed, anonymous and unburdened by family histories. My coffee cup trembled slightly as I held it, not from cold but from the effort of appearing steady. A woman a few seats away rocked a baby in her arms, humming under her breath. The sound tightened something in my chest. Once, I too had hummed in dim hours, believing my son's future would always carry me along in its wake. Now I was left on the shore, watching the current pull him away. Sleep deprivation makes the world slippery, and after a night flight the mind does not distinguish between dream and insult. I closed my eyes for a moment, but the words repeated themselves with merciless clarity, "Don't come near us." Not "we're tired," not "give us a minute," not even silence. Just rejection, blunt and cold. I could not help but remember the first time I had taken him on a plane. He had been 6, small legs swinging from the airport chair, his excitement spilling into questions about clouds and engines. He had clutched my hand so tightly during takeoff that my fingers tingled long after. Back then, I was the anchor, the safe place. The one he trusted not to let go. How quietly those roles shift, until suddenly you are the one clutching at memories while your grown child pulls away. The boarding call for another flight echoed across the terminal. A family gathered their bags in a practiced shuffle, their chatter easy, careless. I wondered if anyone else sitting there had felt the sting of exclusion so plain, so deliberate. It seemed impossible that such pain could sit unnoticed among the ordinary motions of travel. But perhaps airports are filled with quiet devastations, goodbyes spoken and unspoken, people choosing distance over closeness. Mine was only one among many. I turned my phone over in my hands, tempted to write something back. A single word, perhaps, "Why?" But I knew the silence that would follow. Or worse, more words meant to box me out. I had long suspected that my daughter-in-law found me too present, too opinionated, too unwilling to fade into the background. I had tried, over the years, to step carefully, to weigh every word, to offer help only when asked. Yet here I was, banished anyway. Maybe it was never about my words or silences at all. Maybe my very presence was the problem. Outside the glass, dawn was breaking pale and thin, brushing the horizon with weary light. The air inside smelled faintly of reheated eggs and overbrewed coffee. I felt old in that moment, not in years but in irrelevance. I wanted to cry, but the tears would not come. Instead, there was a hollow in my chest, an ache without release. I rose slowly, as though testing whether my legs could still carry me. They did. The suitcase rattled behind me, its small wheels echoing louder than I liked. I kept my eyes forward as I passed him again. He did not look up. His wife adjusted the blanket around their child, her gaze fixed deliberately away. I walked on, past them, past the invisible boundary they had drawn. I found myself near a quiet corner of the concourse, where a bookstore had just opened its gates. The scent of fresh paper and ink spilled into the hall. I stepped inside, not because I wanted to buy anything, but because I needed the shelter of shelves, the comfort of spines lined neatly in a row. Stories do not turn you away. They open. They wait. My hand traced along the edge of a hard cover, the gesture almost soothing. I thought of the countless times I had held my son's books when he was young, mending torn pages with tape, reading aloud until my voice grew hoarse, marveling at how words could build worlds that sheltered us both. Now those same words felt like small companions in a place where flesh and blood had abandoned me. I lingered there until my breathing steadied, until I could imagine myself not as a discarded mother, but as a woman who still had choices. Yet even as I tried to anchor myself in that thought, the question gnawed: when did I lose him? Was it gradual, a slow erosion of closeness that I failed to notice until the ground gave way? Or was it a single moment, some careless phrase or gesture I had long forgotten but he had carried like a stone? I returned to the gate area, not near them, but far enough to watch from a distance. Their child had stirred, rubbing his eyes with small fists, and for one aching instant he looked in my direction. I raised a hand, a subtle wave, but his mother turned him gently, shielding his view. The gesture was not cruel, but it was firm. I was not to be part of that morning, not even in the glance of a sleepy boy. The final boarding call for their flight rang out. My son gathered their things, slinging a diaper bag over his shoulder with practiced ease. He looked tired, older than I remembered. But still he did not look at me. As they walked down the jet bridge, I sat very still, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I waited until the gate agent closed the door, until the crowd dispersed and the space emptied, leaving only silence. That silence was mine. And in it, I realized something small but sharp: I had obeyed. I had stayed away. Whatever they had feared, that I would intrude, that I would cling, I had proven otherwise. I had walked past without making a scene. But inside me, another decision was forming, quiet and steady. If they would not make space for me, I would begin to find a space of my own. Not yet, not with any clear plan. But the seed was there. A shift, almost imperceptible, like the first tilt of the earth towards spring though the air is still cold. For now, I gathered my suitcase and rose. The day outside was just beginning, and so, it seemed, was I. The crowd around gate C12 thinned until the rows of chairs stood nearly empty, only a few travelers slouched with earbuds or bent over phones. The cleaning staff arrived with their carts, plastic bags rustling as they moved between seats. I sat still, holding the handle of my suitcase as though it tethered me to the world. For a long time, I did nothing but listen to the scrape of brooms and the faint, persistent hum of the airport. Eventually, I rose and began walking with no clear destination. The airport at that hour carried a strange intimacy, stores still half closed, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, announcements echoing too loudly in the half-empty spaces. I passed a cafe where a man in a business suit stirred sugar into his coffee with weary precision, his face pale with fatigue. For a moment, I considered sitting there, ordering another cup, but I kept walking. My body felt restless, my mind too full to be still. I ended up near a bank of windows overlooking the runway. A plane lifted into the sky, its engines rising into a roar that shook the glass. I thought of my son and his family strapped into one of those seats, the child perhaps already lulled back into sleep, his small head pressed against his mother's shoulder. I wondered if he had asked about me, or if children learned silence by the example of adults. The thought stung, because it meant the boy might grow up never knowing me except as a shadow hovering at a distance. I tried to push the thought away. I told myself, you are still a whole person. Yet in that moment, I did not feel whole. I felt like a hollowed-out version of myself, defined not by what I was but by what I had been excluded from. The ache of it filled me, heavy as stone. I decided to leave the terminal, not because I had anywhere to go, but because sitting in the echo of their absence was unbearable. Outside, the morning air smelled damp, touched with the faint exhaust of shuttles circling the curb. I found a bench by the pickup zone, pulled my sweater tighter, and sat. Travelers hurried past with bags, climbing into waiting cars, greeted with hugs or impatience. No one waited for me. I called for a taxi. The driver was silent, which I appreciated. I watched the city slip by through the window, buildings stacked against the sky, streets slick from a night of rain. I could have gone straight home, but the thought of entering that quiet house, of laying my suitcase down in the hall where no one would ask about my trip, was too much to bear. Instead, I asked the driver to drop me in front of a small diner I remembered from years before. The diner had changed little. The same cracked leather booths, the same neon sign buzzing faintly above the window. I slid into a corner booth and ordered tea and toast. When it arrived, I tore the bread into small pieces I barely tasted. Around me, the low murmur of conversations created a cocoon of anonymity. People spoke of work, of weather, of errands. I wanted, for a moment, to lean across the table to the nearest stranger and confess, "My son told me not to come near." But of course, I stayed silent. My grief was not their business. Instead, I pulled a small notebook from my bag. I had carried it for months, jotting down errands, grocery lists, the occasional recipe. Now I opened to a blank page. I wrote the words exactly as he had sent them, "Don't come near us." The act of putting them on paper separated them from the glowing cruelty of the phone screen. They became ink, finite, contained. Still painful, but less alive somehow. I stared at the sentence, then closed the notebook gently, as though shutting a door. As I sat there, I thought back to the last holiday we had shared. Christmas, 2 years ago. I remembered standing in his kitchen, stirring gravy while laughter drifted from the living room where he and his wife played with their son. I had felt, then, like part of the family. Not central, not indispensable, but included. I had believed the future would hold more such evenings, that the thread of belonging would continue. How quickly that thread can fray, until one day it is gone entirely. I finished my tea slowly, the warmth steadying me. As I left, the waitress smiled politely, her kindness a small balm. Outside, the air had warmed. I walked without direction, letting the rhythm of my steps soothe the jagged edges inside me. I passed shop windows, a park with children on swings, a florist arranging buckets of blooms. I stopped for a moment, drawn by the scent of roses drifting from the open door. My hand hovered above a pale pink blossom, soft as memory. I did not buy anything, but the fragrance lingered as I walked away. It reminded me that beauty still existed, even on mornings like this. At a bus stop, I sat again. My suitcase stood at my feet, the one faithful companion of the day. I thought about how my life had become marked by waiting, for calls, for invitations, for small scraps of acknowledgement. I realized how much of my identity I had left in other people's hands, waiting for them to grant me permission to matter. The recognition stung, but it was also clarifying. When the bus came, I climbed aboard and let it carry me through the city. I watched neighborhoods shift, brick houses, graffiti walls, tidy gardens. Each window offered a glimpse of lives unfolding, ordinary and intact. My own life felt anything but intact, yet as the bus rumbled on, I began to imagine what it would mean to stop waiting. To stop circling my son's world like a satellite hoping for gravity to pull me close. I returned home hours later. The house was exactly as I had left it, curtains drawn, dishes clean, the faint scent of lavender from the candle I had burned the night before. I placed my suitcase in the corner, where it seemed suddenly unnecessary, as though mocking me for bringing it back unused. I sat at the kitchen table, the silence pressing in. I boiled water and made another cup of tea. This time, I did not hurry. I let the steam rise, the scent of leaves steeping fill the air. I carried the cup to the living room and sat by the window, watching the world outside. People walked dogs, children tugged backpacks. Life moved, indifferent to my private wound. As I sipped, I thought again of the notebook in my bag. Of the sentence I had written down. I pulled it out and opened to the page. This time, I added beneath it, "But I am still here." The words surprised me. They were not planned. Yet once they were written, I felt something loosen inside. It was not healing, not yet, but a small reclaiming, a reminder that my existence did not depend solely on where I was welcomed or rejected. The day stretched on quietly. I moved through the house, dusting shelves, folding laundry, placing order where I could. Small tasks steadied me, gave shape to hours that might otherwise have collapsed into grief. In the evening, I cooked myself a simple meal: roasted chicken, potatoes, green beans. I set the table with care, even though it was only for me. As I ate, I felt the first flicker of something I could not quite name. Not hope, not joy, but perhaps a kind of defiance. A whisper that said, "You can still choose how to live." Later, before bed, I stood in front of the mirror. My face looked drawn, the skin around my eyes etched with fatigue. But beneath that, I saw resilience, faint but real. I thought of the airport, of the moment I had obeyed and walked past. And I realized obedience was not the same as defeat. It was restraint. It was dignity. I turned off the light and climbed into bed. The house was silent, the night cool. Sleep did not come quickly, but as I lay there, I repeated to myself the words I had written: "I am still here." Over and over, until the rhythm of them carried me, gently, into rest. The morning after I wrote those words, "I am still here," I woke earlier than usual. Light was just beginning to seep through the curtains, pale and tentative, as if the day itself was unsure of its welcome. My body felt heavy with the residue of yesterday, but my mind was restless. I brewed coffee instead of tea, the stronger scent filling the kitchen, and stood at the window watching the streets slowly wake. For months, maybe years, I had allowed myself to drift into routines shaped around waiting. Waiting for calls, for visits, for some invitation to step into my son's life. Yesterday had shown me, with brutal clarity, how thin that thread had become. So this morning, I decided, however small the gesture, I would move differently. I dressed in clothes I hadn't worn in a long while: a navy skirt, a soft blouse. Not fancy, not even particularly new, but chosen with care rather than default. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who had taken the time to present herself to the world, rather than someone resigned to invisibility. I took a walk. The air was brisk, scented faintly with cut grass and damp pavement. Each step seemed to shake off a little of the heaviness that had sat in me since the airport. I passed a bakery where the smell of fresh bread floated out, warm and inviting. Without thinking too much, I stepped inside. The young woman behind the counter smiled as I ordered a small loaf and a croissant. Her friendliness was ordinary, but it touched me more deeply than I expected. I sat by the window with my pastry, watching people come and go: workers with lanyards, mothers pushing strollers, students with backpacks slung carelessly. They all seemed to belong to the rhythm of life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt as though I was brushing against that rhythm too. It was then I noticed an older man seated across the cafe, his newspaper spread wide. Every few minutes he would glance out the window, then fold the page carefully before moving to the next. When our eyes met briefly, he nodded, a small, polite acknowledgement between strangers. It startled me, how seen I felt by that simple gesture. After finishing my coffee, I walked to the small park nearby. Children shrieked on the swings, dogs pulled impatiently at leashes, joggers traced circles around the path. I sat on a bench, the bread warm in my lap, and let the sounds of life wash over me. I realized then how long it had been since I allowed myself to simply sit among people, without purpose other than being present. Memories rose unbidden: afternoons spent at playgrounds when my son was young, his laughter carrying across the air as he chased other children. I had always been the mother watching closely, quick to intervene if he fell, quick to praise when he climbed high. Back then, I had believed my attention would always be welcome. But now I saw how attention, too, can become heavy when a child grows, when the weight of it feels like surveillance instead of love. Perhaps I had failed to step back at the right time. Perhaps my closeness had become, to him, a burden. The thought hurt, but I did not push it away. I let it sit beside me, like an unwelcome companion, and in doing so I felt its sharpness dull just a little. Reflection does not erase pain, but it gives it shape, and shape makes it bearable. On my way home, I stopped at the florist I had passed the day before. This time I stepped inside. Buckets of roses, tulips, and daisies filled the shop with a heady fragrance. I chose a small bouquet of sunflowers, their bold faces unapologetic, their color like captured sunlight. When I placed them in a vase on my kitchen table, the room seemed instantly less hollow. That afternoon, I pulled my notebook again. I wrote about the bakery, the park, the flowers. Small things, yet they marked a shift. I realized I was writing not just to record, but to remind myself, the world still opens if you step into it. As evening came, I cooked the bread I had bought into a simple meal, slices with cheese, a bowl of soup. I ate slowly, the sunflowers bright against the fading light. And for the first time in a long while, I felt not like someone waiting, but like someone beginning. Of course, the ache remained. It rose in waves, the memory of my son's turned face, the text still etched behind my eyes. But alongside the ache was a quieter current, one that whispered, "Your life does not end where theirs excludes you." Before bed, I returned to the mirror. My reflection was still lined with fatigue, but I touched the edge of my blouse, the faint trace of perfume I had dabbed on my wrist. These small acts had not changed the larger truth, but they had changed me, if only a little. I whispered aloud, softly so as not to disturb the silence, "I am still here." The words no longer sounded like defiance alone. They sounded like a beginning. The following week unfolded differently than most I could remember. For years my days had blended together, their sameness a quiet cocoon. I cooked the same meals, walked the same streets, kept to the safety of my home. But after that morning at the bakery, after the park and the flowers, I found myself needing, to stretch beyond those narrow walls. It began with the simplest of things. I rose earlier, not because I had to but because the light called me. I lingered less over tea, dressed with care, and opened the door as if it were an invitation rather than a barrier. Each small act of stepping outside felt like proof I was not finished. One morning I wandered into the public library. The scent of old paper and dust wrapped around me like an embrace I hadn't known I missed. Rows upon rows of books lined the shelves, and for a moment I stood still, overwhelmed not by choice but by abundance. The world, in this place, did not shrink. It expanded endlessly. I ran my fingers along the spines until I pulled one at random, a memoir by a woman who had traveled alone late in life. I sat in a chair by the window, opened to the first page, and soon found myself absorbed. Her words spoke of fear of loneliness, of being invisible, but also of courage, of discovering new strength when the familiar fell away. I felt as though she had written across time directly to me. I checked out the book and carried it home like a secret companion. That evening, instead of turning on the television, I read. Each chapter stirred something dormant, reminding me of the voice I still carried inside. A voice that was not defined by rejection, but by resilience. The next day, I walked again to the bakery. This time the young woman behind the counter recognized me. "Back so soon?" she said, smiling warmly. I laughed, surprised by the sound of it. I ordered bread and coffee, sat at the same table, and let the comfort of routine settle in. When I left, she wished me a good day, and the words clung to me like a small kindness. Later that week, I noticed a flyer pinned to the library bulletin board, a local history talk at the community center. Ordinarily, I would have walked past such a notice, telling myself it wasn't for me. But now I paused, copied the date into my notebook, and told myself, go. The night of the event, I almost talked myself out of it. I stood by the door, my coat in hand, the familiar gravity of solitude pulling at me. But then I remembered the words I had written, "I am still here," and I stepped outside before I could change my mind. The community center buzzed with quiet chatter. People milled about, pouring coffee into paper cups, settling into folding chairs. I chose a seat near the back, heart thudding with nerves. But as the speaker began, an elderly man recounting the early history of the town, I felt my tension ease. His voice was steady, his stories rich with detail. Around me, strangers nodded, laughed, murmured. I was one of them, part of an audience, part of something shared. Afterward, as people gathered their coats, I found myself speaking to the woman beside me. She was gray-haired, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. We exchanged a few words about the talk, then she asked if I lived nearby. I told her yes, and before I knew it, we were walking out together, our conversation easy, unforced. Her name was Margaret. She told me she came to these talks often, that she enjoyed the company more than the lectures. As we parted at the corner, she touched my arm lightly and said, "Maybe I'll see you again next time." The simplicity of it warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. That night, as I undressed for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My face was still lined with fatigue, but something else glowed faintly there, an energy I hadn't seen in years. I whispered again, "I am still here." The words no longer sounded like a plea. They sounded like truth. Still, the ache of my son's rejection did not disappear. It visited me in quiet moments, while stirring soup, while folding laundry, while waking in the night. Sometimes I replayed the text in my mind, wondering what had led him to write it. Was it his decision alone, or hers? Did he resent me, or was he simply protecting his own fragile peace? The questions circled endlessly, without answer. But here was the difference: the questions no longer paralyzed me. They rose, they hurt, and then they settled, leaving space for other thoughts. For books, for sunflowers, for bakeries, for community talks. For life, however modest, that was mine alone. As weeks passed, I began to weave new threads into my days. Margaret and I met again at another lecture, then for coffee afterward. We spoke of books, of gardens, of the peculiar joys and trials of living alone. Her companionship was light but steady, like a lamp in a dim room. I returned often to the library, borrowing more memoirs, letting the voices of others remind me that solitude need not mean emptiness. I filled my home with small rituals, fresh flowers on the table, a pot of soup simmering on Sundays, notes scribbled in my journal each evening. One afternoon, while arranging tulips in a vase, I felt a sudden rush of tears. Not from sadness alone, but from the realization that I had survived. That I had begun to carve a life not defined by exclusion, but by presence. My own presence. I thought then of my grandson, his small head resting on his mother's shoulder in the airport. I longed to hold him, to hear his laugh. That longing would never leave me. But I understood now that my love for him did not vanish simply because I was not granted access to his days. It lived in me still, steady as breath. And perhaps, one day, he would seek me out. Or perhaps not. Either way, I would remain. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote, "I am not only here. I am living." The words startled me, but as I looked at them, I realized they were true. My life had narrowed, but it had not ended. And within that narrowness, I was finding depth I had long overlooked. The ache would always be part of me. But so too would the strength to rise, to walk, to choose. To live. The days were beginning to grow longer, the late winter light stretching itself thin into evening. I noticed it one afternoon as I walked home from the library, book tucked under my arm, the air cold but edged with something softer, something that hinted at change. For weeks I had been adding small stitches to the fabric of my life, lectures, coffee with Margaret, flowers on the table, and now those stitches were beginning to form a pattern. Not a grand tapestry, not yet, but something that looked like a life being mended. And still, there were moments when the ache rose sharp, catching me unaware. One such evening, I was preparing dinner when my phone buzzed. For an instant, my heart leapt, hoping irrationally that it was my son. It was only an advertisement from the grocery store. I set the phone down and stared at it, ashamed of the way my body had betrayed me with hope. I sat at the kitchen table and let the silence settle around me. It would be so easy, I thought, to send him a message. To ask how he was, to plead for a sliver of space in his life. But I had learned, painfully, that to chase would only push him further. I could not beg for love that was withheld. So instead, I opened my notebook. I wrote the words I could not send to him: "I miss you. I miss the sound of your voice. I miss the boy who once clutched my hand on an airplane. I miss the man who called me when he bought his first house. I miss you, and I do not know how to stop." The ink blurred slightly as my hand shook, but I kept writing until the page was full. Then I closed the notebook and sat quietly, my tears falling not as torrents but as steady drops, like rain easing from a cloud. When the tears slowed, I realized something I had not before. Even in my missing, I was still whole. My love did not vanish simply because it went unanswered. It lived in me, and it could live alongside the pain. The next morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I visited the art museum downtown. I used to go often, when my son was young, dragging him reluctantly through galleries until he learned to linger at the paintings himself. But as the years passed, and life became busier, I had stopped. Now, as I walked through the wide, quiet halls, I felt both like a stranger and like someone returning home. I paused before a large canvas, a painting of a solitary woman walking along a shoreline. Her head was bowed, her scarf whipping in the wind, but her steps were steady. I stood there for a long time, staring at her. It was as though the painter had captured me, not in likeness, but in essence. Alone, yes, but still moving forward. Still choosing the path before her. I sat on a bench across from the painting and let myself breathe. Around me, tourists murmured, children tugged at parents, the world spun with its ordinary rhythms. And there I was, part of it. Not hidden in the corners of my son's absence, but present in the wide, echoing halls of a museum, face to face with art that reminded me who I still was. Later that week, Margaret invited me to her home for tea. Her house was modest, filled with books stacked in every corner, the scent of lavender drifting through the rooms. We spoke for hours, of gardens, of travel, of regrets and small joys. At one point she looked at me directly and said, "You know, you carry yourself like someone who has weathered storms. But I can tell, you're still standing." Her words struck me deeply. To be seen, truly seen, without judgment or agenda, it was a gift I hadn't realized I was craving. That night, as I undressed for bed, I replayed her voice in my mind, still standing. It became another phrase I carried with me, alongside "I am still here." One afternoon, while shopping at the market, I passed a young mother scolding her child gently for wandering too far. The boy clutched her hand afterward, pressing close to her side. I felt a familiar ache watching them, but this time, instead of collapsing inward, I found myself smiling softly. That bond was theirs, just as mine had once been with my son. It did not diminish me to witness it. It reminded me of what I had given, what had been real, even if it no longer remained in the same form. As spring edged closer, I began to think of larger steps. Perhaps a class, perhaps travel, perhaps something that would push me further beyond the narrow orbit I had inhabited. I didn't yet know what it would be, but I could feel the stirring of possibility. One evening, sitting by the window with my notebook, I wrote, "He may never open the door again. But I will not live pressed against it, waiting. I will build other doors, and I will walk through them." The words startled me with their firmness, but they felt true. I underlined them, closed the book, and sat in the quiet, a strange calm settling over me. The hurt of his rejection would always be part of me, carved deep into the bone of my days. But slowly, I was learning that pain did not have to be the whole story. That I could choose not just survival, but life. Spring arrived almost without announcement. One morning I opened the window and found the air soft, scented faintly of earth and rain. The trees outside were greening, buds swelling at their tips, birds darting busily as though they had been waiting for this very moment. Something inside me answered that urgency. I wanted to move, to stretch beyond the familiar corners I had begun to reclaim. It was Margaret who suggested the day trip. "There's a bus that goes out to the coast," she said over tea. "I take it every now and then when I need reminding that the world is larger than my own worries." She looked at me, her eyes steady. "You should come." I hesitated. Travel had always been bound up with family for me, packing suitcases, arranging visits, carrying gifts. To go somewhere simply for myself felt strange, almost indulgent. But indulgence, I realized, was not the same as waste. It was, perhaps, a way of saying, my life still deserves beauty. So I agreed. On the morning of the trip, I boarded the bus with Margaret, our bags light, our jackets tucked on our laps. The ride took us through small towns, past fields rippling with new grass, until at last the horizon widened into sea. The coast stretched vast and blue, the sound of waves carrying even before we stepped off. We walked slowly along the shore, our shoes sinking into sand, the wind tugging at our clothes. Margaret soon wandered ahead, her gaze caught by seashells scattered along the tide line. I lagged behind, content to move at my own pace. The ocean lay before me, endless, indifferent, magnificent. Standing there, I felt something shift. For months I had carried the wound of my son's words like a stone pressing into my chest. Here, with the salt wind on my face and the waves crashing endlessly, that stone seemed smaller, not gone but no longer crushing. The sea did not care who had rejected me. The sea did not measure my worth by family bonds. It simply moved, constant and alive. I walked to the water's edge and let the tide lap at my shoes. The chill startled me, but I did not step back. Instead, I stood and let it wash over me again, a rhythm older and steadier than any human judgment. For the first time since that morning at gate C12, I felt unbound. Later, as Margaret and I ate sandwiches on a bench overlooking the cliffs, she said quietly, "You seem lighter." I smiled, unable to explain fully, but she was right. Something had loosened. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but release. When I returned home that evening, the house no longer felt like a hollow shell. It felt like a place I had chosen to return to, not one I had been exiled into. I placed a new bouquet of sunflowers on the table, their bold faces catching the last light of day. That night, I pulled out my notebook. I read back through the pages, my son's cruel text, my tears, my small victories, my reflections. Then I turned to a blank page and wrote, "At the gate, I thought my life had ended. But it was only beginning again, in another form." I set down the pen and sat in silence, the words settling into me. They were not dramatic, not triumphant. But they were mine. In the weeks that followed, I continued to build. More walks, more flowers, more lectures, more tea with Margaret. I began volunteering at the library, shelving books, helping children find stories. The small hands clutching at titles, the wide eyes lighting up with discovery, it stirred something deep in me, a reminder that care could still flow outward, even if not in the direction I once imagined. And sometimes, when loneliness pressed in, I would return to the museum, standing again before the painting of the solitary woman on the shore. Each time I saw her, I noticed something new, the curve of her scarf, the determination in her posture. Each time, I recognized myself more clearly. There were still nights I lay awake, aching for my grandson, for the sound of my son's voice softened by love instead of sharpened by rejection. That ache would never vanish. But it no longer defined me. It was one thread in the weave of my life, no longer the whole cloth. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the street outside filled with the laughter of children, I sat by the window and whispered again, "I am still here. I am still living. And that is enough." I thought then of the last time I had seen my son, his eyes turned away in the airport. I wondered if he would ever turn back, if years from now he might search for me. I could not know. But for the first time, the not knowing did not break me. It simply was. The final light of day lingered across the room, painting the walls in gold. I sat quietly, breathing it in, and felt the steady pulse of my own heart. Whatever came next, whether reconciliation or distance, whether solitude or companionship, I knew this, I had not disappeared. I had walked past the gate where I was unwelcome. And in doing so, I had walked into myself.